Okay, today is day number 2 of tackle organization. I say this is day number 2, but it's really, I only spent about a half an hour in the boat yesterday, and then I spent the rest of the day just editing videos. I now have tackle out of most of the compartments, but it's now all over the front deck of the boat. Today, we're gonna talk about another plastic worm. In the last video, we talked about the Cinco, and the Cinco is one of the best lures on the market to catch a bass. This plastic worm is another extremely good soft plastic, and it's not a secret lure by any means. It's a soft plastic that a lot of us already own. And like the Yamamoto Cinco, it's one that comes in a million different colors. And like the Cinco, there's really only a handful that I like. So today, it's all about the Zoom trick worm. The colors that I talk about are the colors that I have a lot of confidence in. It's the ones that I choose to use. There's a lot of different soft plastics out there that guys are confident in, and that is the most important part when it comes to pretty much any lure that you use. But I'm gonna go through the colors that have worked for me across the United States, wherever I have fished. I keep it simple, so let's get to it. Now you may be watching this right now and be thinking, why is that guy wearing a sun shirt when he's in his garage on a cloudy day? And to be honest, it's solely for marketing purposes. The other thing is right now at finfishing.com, if you buy this shirt, you can actually get this shirt for just $16. It's a great deal. Again, buy this shirt, get this shirt for just $16 while supplies last. Also, don't forget to check out these awesome hats. So if you guys wanna pick up 2 shirts for the best price, click that link below in the description, finfishing.com. The Zoom trick worm is just one of those soft plastics that we really should all own. No matter if you fish in big ponds, if you fish in lakes, if you fish in reservoirs, no matter what it is, there's a point during the season where you can catch a lot of fish on a Zoom trick worm. And there's just something that's very simple about it. To me, it's a lot like the Cinco. A Cinco is a very simple bait. The Zoom trick worm is also a very simple bait. I use it in a lot of the same situations that I would use a Cinco, but there's also some situations that I use this trick worm for that I don't use a Cinco at all for. I do keep all of my Zoom trick worms in just your 3700 style box, and we're gonna go through it right now. I'm gonna tell you about the situations where I use these specific colors. All right, guys, the first Zoom trick worm that you absolutely need to have, and this is by far my favorite trick worm color. This is the one that when this bite is happening, when this bite is on, I am just a happy person. No, I'm just kidding. I'm always a happy person, but I love fishing this color in a technique that I'll talk about in just a second. That first color is bubblegum. Bubblegum, guys, bubblegum, bubblegum, bubblegum. There are 2 situations that I really like to use a bubblegum trick worm. The first situation is any time that I am sight fishing for bass. If I am visibly looking at a fish and trying to catch it off of its bed, one of the best colors and one that is a little bit under the radar, not everyone throws, is a bubblegum trick worm. Now I know that some guys are very against catching fish off their beds, and I don't necessarily go out and catch fish off beds just for fun, but I have fished a lot of tournaments where if you are not fishing for fish on a bed, you're simply not going to do well in that tournament. And so sometimes in those tournament situations, I've actually found that a bubblegum trick worm rigged several different ways can actually catch a lot of bass. Now, one way that I love to rig it is on a drop shot. Sometimes fishing this on a drop shot on a bed, it's very easy for you to see that bait. Some fish can get really agitated at that color for whatever reason. I have seen it before where you're pitching at a fish on a bed with your green pumpkins or a white or whatever it may be, the fish will not eat it, and you throw that bubble gum at them and they will gobble it right up. So fishing this on a drop shot, 1, you can visibly see it, but 2, it really does take the bass off. Now that is the first situation. Now the second situation where I love this bubblegum trick worm, this is probably one of my favorite ways to fish, like, period. It is one of my absolute favorite ways, and that is fishing this in a technique that we call a floating worm. Now, fishing a floating worm is really an old school technique. This is something that guys used to do way back in the day, and for some reason, it's kind of become a little less unpopular. There are some anglers that definitely still utilize it, and the bass absolutely loved it. You know, I've caught them in Ohio where I live a lot. but I caught them on Lake Norman extremely well doing this, and I actually got 13th in a Bassmaster Open by strictly fishing a floating worm. And something that was really interesting about fishing it there is I would catch some spotted bass on that fishery with the floating worm, but I caught majority largemouth. And if you catch more largemouth on Lake Norman, you tend to do a little bit better in tournaments. Now you may be watching this and say, hey Tyler, a trick worm does not float, and you are absolutely correct. I don't know exactly why a floating worm got the name that it does, because you don't really necessarily fish a worm that actually floats on the surface. But with a floating worm, you keep it extremely high in the water column. I am almost always seeing the bait literally about a foot, maybe 2 foot at most below the surface of the water, but the entire time, the entire cast, I can see that worm, which makes this bite extremely exciting, because a lot of times you're gonna see those bass just come up and smoke that bait, and it is just super fun. Now you can fish the floating worm wacky rigged, which is something that I really like to do, and you can also fish it Texas rigged, which helps it to come through cover a lot better. Now I actually made a video devoted to the floating worm. I'll put it down in the description if you guys want to check that out. Now when I'm fishing a floating worm, I typically fish in a little bit clearer water, and that's when I like to use the bubble gum. Now if I'm fishing more off-colored water, or water that has a little bit of a stain to it, I actually go with my second color of a trick worm, and that is called Methylate. Methylate is another one of those old school colors. You know, if you've been fishing a long time, you probably know of this color. Now this is probably one of the only situations that I use this color for, and again, it's fishing it as a floating worm. But the thing about this Methylate color is it almost glows in the water. If you throw it in the water, it's almost like the bait has a halo around it. It's really weird, and it's hard for me to kind of describe. You really just have to pick one up, put it in the water for you to be able to see this. But that is when if I'm fishing a little bit more off-color water, that is when I pick up the Methylate floating worm over the bubblegum floating worm. You can fish the floating worm technique with a ton of different colors. You can fish it with a white. People fish them with greens. There's all kinds of different colors that you can use. These two are my favorite and the ones that I use the majority of the time. All right, moving on to the third color that I absolutely love in a trick worm. And this is one that if you guys watch the Cinco video, I talked a lot about it, because this particular color is one that I really love. That is a green pumpkin with green and purple flake. And the reason that I like the green flake the most is, if you guys don't know much about how a bass sees color under the water, a bass can see greens the best, which is obviously why green pumpkin works really well. But the thing is that bass can see green in a broader view than a human can, which means they might actually pick up on more shades of green than we can visibly see, period. So having a green pumpkin with a little bit of that green flake, I just feel that sometimes I can get more bites on this particular color than I will your standard green pumpkin. Now, when I do use that standard green pumpkin, which is, you know, green pumpkin color, usually with a little bit of black flake, is when I have really still conditions. Now, this particular color, I typically fish it one of about 3 different ways. One is on a shaky head. You know, a shaky head and a trick worm really go hand to hand. I usually still use the full-size trick worm most of the time. If I want a smaller presentation, I'll simply just bite off, you know, the first inch or so of it to give it a little bit smaller presentation. Now, I also will use this for a Nico rig, especially if I'm fishing really clear water. I think that you can never go wrong with a green pumpkin in a Nico rig. Now, one thing that I learned when I was really young, and it definitely applies to this color, but honestly it applies to any of these colors, is that a lot of guys don't think about fishing a Zoom trick worm as a wacky rig. We think a lot of times of the shaky heads, the Nico rigs, maybe the drop shots. But a wacky rig is something that just doesn't always come to mind, because why? Because we have a Cinco. And the thing about a Cinco is it's extremely easy for us to cast a Cinco. It's a little bit more difficult to cast a weightless trick worm. It simply doesn't have the amount of salt. It doesn't have the bulk that a Cinco has. It's a little bit more difficult, but it falls in a little bit more of a finessey way in the water column. And what I learned actually from getting whooped by my cousin, and this was literally just us fun fishing one day. We were really young, 13, 14 years old, and we were out there fishing in my parents' pond. It has really clear water. We were both throwing weightless Senkos, you know, just catching fish, right? Just having fun. We had run out of some Senkos, and I had a few still on me that I was using. He actually picked up a trick worm and rigged it the wacky style and just started fishing it the same way. And he started getting a lot more bites than we were getting. The thing is that we had been fishing Senkos all summer long. And what I think happened is the bass got conditioned to it. And so when he put on a trick worm, which is just a little bit more of a different fall, the bass reacted to it. It was like they never seen it before. And he started catching a lot of fish, and it just, like I said, it just clicked for me. And so ever since then, anytime I'm fishing around a very highly pressured situation, using a wacky worm with a trick worm is something that I really like to do. All right, moving on to the fourth color that I think that you guys need to have in your tackle box at all times, and that is straight up watermelon. Like I said before, bass can see green really, really well in the water. And watermelon is just a little bit different color than that green pumpkin. And where I like to use watermelon is really in the clearest of clear water situations. There are some lakes across the nation, you know, lakes that I fished like in South Carolina and North Carolina, I mean, all over the place, even up in New York, that are just extremely clear. Like you can see down 10, 15, 20 foot of water. And there's even ponds that are this exact same way. Sometimes you fish those really, really clear water ponds, and that watermelon color, it's very natural, just seems to do really, really well in clear water. Now again, I'm gonna use this watermelon color on a shaky head. A lot of times if I'm fishing clear water, I like to finesse fish a little bit more. So in that situation, I'm gonna use a shaky head over a Texas rig, because a lot of times you can fish a shaky head on a little bit lighter line, and that shaky head really allows that bait to kind of stand up off the bottom, which I think can be extremely important when you're fishing clear water. Let's move on to the next trick worm color that I think that you really need to have in your tackle box, and that is some sort of black and blue color. Black and blue is really a staple in bass fishing. We throw a lot of black and blue jigs. I really like a black and blue crankbait. Now, a couple situations where I do like to fish the black and blue over a lot of the other colors is one, whenever I'm fishing cold water, no matter the water clarity, whether it's gin clear or whether it's very muddy, I have found that for some reason a black and blue can work really well during the middle of winter. That is actually also something that I do with jigs. You know, for instance, just a couple of weeks ago, I was bank fishing a lake and the water was in the 40s, and I picked up a black and blue jig versus a green pumpkin jig and caught quite a few fish on that black and blue jig. And the same thing applies to the trick worm. It just tends to outproduce the other colors. Now, the other situation where black and blue works really good for me is in tannic water. You know, you have that tannic color, that tea color water in several different states. There's a lot in Florida. I know there's some in Louisiana. I've even seen that tannic color, that tea colored water up in New York. And a lot of times I'm gonna be fishing this on a light Texas rig. What I love to do, this is actually the way that I caught one of my first like personal best bass, was a 7-pound even bass down in Florida. I was flipping a light Texas rig, only a 1/4 ounce weight, into holes of grass, and I caught a 7-pounder on a black and blue trick worm just like this. So black and blue, it's nothing new. That rhymes. But it's a great color to have in a trick worm that can always catch a lot of bass. The next colored lure that I really like in a trick worm is a June bug red color, okay? And that's the one that I really like. I'm sure you could probably do this with your standard June bug color, but I really like to have a little bit of that red glitter in there. And there's two situations that I really like the June bug red for. And one is if I'm fishing off colored water, but I feel like the bass want a finesse presentation, that's when I'm usually gonna fish this on like a light Texas rig. You know, sometimes during the spring or sometimes during that late summer period when the fish have seen a lot of fishing pressure, I think that is when you can go behind guys with a Texas rigged June bug worm in that off-colored water and catch shallow bass that aren't eating baits like spinner baits and crankbaits and jigs. Now, another situation where I really like the June bug red color is anytime I'm fishing around hydrilla. Hydrilla grows in a ton of different lakes across the country. Hydrilla grows a lot in lakes in Florida, in Texas. I've seen it in Virginia. I've seen it actually in Ohio. I've seen it everywhere, and it seems like anywhere you have hydrilla, a June bug can work really, really well. Now, I've never fished in Texas before, and I know that Texas does have a lot of hydrilla. I assume that it works well in Texas, but I don't know that for a fact. But I have fished in Florida where there's a lot of hydrilla. I have fished in Virginia where there's a lot of hydrilla. And in those lakes, a June bug works really, really well. So if you have hydrilla in the lake that you are fishing, pick up that June bug for whatever reason, maybe the way it contrasts with the hydrilla. I don't know why, but it just seems like the June bug works really well. The next colored worm, and I actually don't have any with me at the moment, but this is one that I use a lot, and it's really one that I use a lot during the middle of summer, and that is a plum colored trick worm. Plum is just a color that works well during the summer for me. A couple years ago, I was fishing Lake Chickamauga and I was fishing a Zoom Old Monster worm in plum color, and a guy that was fishing in the back of my boat was fishing the exact same worm, the exact same weight, everything was the exact same, but he was fishing green pumpkin. And I was getting a lot more bites than he was. And we were fishing a big grass flat where really you could catch a bass really kind of in any direction that you fished. But I was getting a substantial amount more bites than he was. And he actually ended up borrowing some of my plum colored Zoom Monster worms, and he started catching fish. And that was a time where the color really made a big difference. Now, I like that plum color in a trick worm when I'm fishing during the summer, specifically when I fish a Nico rig. I am definitely not gonna say I'm an expert when it comes to fishing a Nico rig. I think it's a finesse technique that I have fished the least amount out of a lot of finesse techniques, but the most success I've had with a Nico rig is in that plum color. One specific situation that I like to fish is fishing a Nico rig around, wood cover offshore during the summer. So if I'm fishing it on brush piles or if I'm fishing it around stumps, that is where I really like to fish that Nico rig, and plum is the color that I go with every single time. That is 7 of the 8 colors that are in my trick worm box, and those are the ones that I have taken all over the country and caught a lot of bass in. Now for your 8th color, again, I'm gonna leave the 8th color up to you, because I'm guessing that in your neck of the woods, there is a color that for whatever reason tends to work better than all these other colors. It could be watermelon red, it could be pumpkin. There's a number of different colors that it could be. I hope that you guys enjoyed this style of video. If you guys wanna check out the fin fishing gear, you can click that link right there. And if you wanna watch kind of the first video I did in this series about Senko fishing, you can click that video right there. Subscribe to the channel, comment below your 8th color that you would pick out, and I'll see you guys in the next video.